At 6,592,800 square miles, Russia is the world's largest country. With a population of over 143,700,000 people, Russia has a definite, unique culture. There are dramatic weather differences, from the coldest negative 96.2 degrees Fahrenheit in winter to the highest 104 degrees Fahrenheit in the height of summer. The Russian government has a long history of human rights violations. The current constitution was adopted on December 12, 1993, and came into force 13 days later. It abolished the Soviet government and is the most long-lived constitution thus far in Russia's history. This constitution granted the president extensive power over the legislative and executive functions. In the 2000s, President Vladimir Putin exploited these powers to gain authority. So why did Russian citizens allow this to happen? After the fall of the Soviet Union, the country was thrown into chaos. The political institutions were weakened by corruption, lack of resources, and the fallen economy. So when Putin ran for presidency, promising economic and political order, he became hugely popular. By 2008, Putin's administration had control over most of the mass media, regional leadership, the political parties, and even civil society. Putin then stepped down in favor of his colleague Dmitry Medvedev and took the place of prime minister. Although the relations between the government and human rights workers has softened quite a bit since Putin stepped down, the general policy remains the same. Many issues for human rights in Russia have occurred in an area called the Northern Caucasus, the region between the Black and Caspian Seas. There have been several reports of enforced disappearances, civilian killings, and torture, especially of outspoken human rights activists like Anna Politkovskaya. Since 1992, it's been proven that over 56 journalists have been killed in Russia, 89% of which were local people, and 64% of which it's been proven that their cause of death was murder. One of the biggest and probably one of the most talked about recent issues concerning Russia has been the 2014 Winter Olympics. Held in Sochi, it was the most expensive Winter Olympic Games ever held, but some shifty stuff went on behind the scenes to make way for the venues, buildings, and other infrastructure built for the Games. This is Sochi, before the Olympic construction, and this is Sochi after the Olympic construction. Around 2,000 families were evicted from their homes, many without compensation from the government. They were forced to leave their lives behind. The workers who actually built the buildings, including the Central Olympic Stadium, the main Olympic Village, and the main media center, were also exploited. Employers cheated workers out of wages, forced them to work 12-hour shifts without days off, and confiscated passports and work permits to stop workers from quitting. When migrant workers tried to protest abuses, the employers turned them over to the authorities, causing them to be removed from Russia. And last of all, one of the most controversial issues that has probably been talked about the most concerning the Olympics, Putin's anti-gay law. On June 29, 2013, Putin signed into law a discriminatory bill banning the promotion of information about quote-unquote non-traditional sexuality, which violates the Olympic Charter's statement that any form of discrimination on grounds of race, religion, politics, gender, or otherwise is incompatible with belonging to the Olympic movement. People around the world were outraged, and hundreds of protests have been staged in Russia and the countries around it. Although officials say it wasn't a protest, German uniforms were adorned with bright rainbow colors. Google's homepage doodle featured drawings of different Olympic sports, but made a jab at Russia's anti-gay legislation by not only depicting the sports in the rainbow of gay pride, but also by quoting the Olympic Charter. The practice of sport is a human right. Every individual must have the possibility of practicing sport without discrimination of any kind and in the Olympic spirit, which requires a mutual understanding with the spirit of friendship, solidarity, and fair play. Protests against the anti-gay law, among many other human rights violation protests, have been going on in Russia and the countries around it for a very long time. People in other countries haven't really been very involved in these protests since up until really recently. We haven't been very educated about the situation in Russia. For example, on March 3rd, hundreds of peaceful anti-war protesters were detained in Moscow, Ukraine, and St. Petersburg. Dozens of protesters were kept at police stations overnight, and 2 were charged with 5 days in jail. According to Sergei Nikitin, head of Amnesty International's Moscow office, this is an infringement on freedom of expression and assembly. Unfortunately, although most of the time staged by peaceful people, these protests often get very violent and bloody. Unfortunately, with every news report that comes with news on the situations in Russia comes deeply saddening photos of the people who have faced this brutality and opposition. Although the next generation of Russian citizens will have to work to get their country united again, good always wins. We can help by staying educated and not turning a blind eye to the injustices going on in Russia, even though it's a country far away from us.